Okay, on with the show. In today's event, we are going to kick off with some input from Jo Collinson Scott, aka Joe Mango, the mastermind behind last night's performance. She'll be sharing some insights into the many threads that were woven together to create a giant on the bridge. We'll then have an opportunity for a couple of questions for 10 minutes or so. After that, I will share a few reflections from the research that I've been doing, and then Fergus will help us to sum up. After that, we'll have another short Q&A. And to close, we've invited Les back, who is a great friend and supporter of Distant Voices, to offer a short reflection on the festival as a whole. We'll also be sticking around at the end after the official end of the event. If people want to stick around for a chat, you're very welcome. Before I hand over to Jo, there's one more thing. In order to give you a tiny flavour of what it feels like to make something together, we're going to try to create a collaborative poem today. A link to a Google Doc is going to be shared in the chat. And in that document, what we're asking you to do as the event goes on, at any point you like, is to complete the sentence, to build bridges, we're going to need ... Complete the sentence in any way you like. If you're tuning in on your phone, it might be hard to switch between windows. So if it's hard to access the Google Doc for any reason, you can just post in the chat your own ending to this sentence. To build bridges, we're going to need... Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully we'll see it all come together at the end. Okay, over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm just going to share my screen with you all. There we go. Great, I hope you're seeing that. Okay, we wanted to start today with some discussion around the giant on the bridge that I'm hoping a number of you watched last night. Perhaps some of you are going to watch again over the coming week. So I'll try and talk in such a way that it won't matter if you haven't seen it, and in a way that won't spoil anything if you're still planning to watch. For those of you who didn't watch it though, here's our little taster video so that you can get a wee sense of it.
Every year in Scotland, thousands of people return home from prison to an uncertain future.
Are you a hero or a villain? You never think that you're the bad guy.
Indivisible, you think I am invisible.
You think because I've been inside, all I know how to do is hurt people?
You beckon us with open arms like nothing's wrong at all. And we're here to lift you up when you fall. A bridge to new beginnings.
I don't want him to go to prison, I say. I just want to know that he won't hurt anyone else.
What happens when we all wish they'd disappear like smoke?
She's dreaming, one hand on her fairy tale book.
Before the sun rose, the young prince crept into his father's chamber.
I don't want the repetition, not going back again to prison. Seen as Neds and villains fed into a defective system meant to try and be a cog, turning in society like clockwork men and women, but I can't figure out the mechanism.
Check. Boom.
As songwriters, if we want to take you somewhere new, we take you to the bridge.
But there's a place we can live in with asking, with answering, a seat we both sit upon to be listened.
So there have been a few questions about how the show was made and who participated in it and how. I wanted to try and keep it light today on discussing methods, but give you a strong sense of some of the ways in which A Giant on the Bridge brings together and creatively synthesizes some of the learning from the Distant Voices project. We use a method of research whereby writing songs together is a way we help understand things better, but I'm also developing a way that we can bring to light and then synthesize or coalesce what we've learned into a larger piece, like writing a research article, but in a creative form. We created some pretty exciting and special wee methods in order to allow a really broad spread of participants to participate in research creation on the project. We called those methods trees and pebbles. I'd love to tell you all about them, but we'll talk about those in more detail elsewhere. in one of the forthcoming podcasts, The Art of Bridging, that Lucy's heading up, and in some blog posts that are going up on my blog this week and will be on the Distant Voices blog too at the end of the festival if you want to read some more. So I'll just touch on those really briefly along the way. Songwriters, Keith Negus and Pete Astertellis, usually construct songs with a set of interlocking parts, which are architectural in character, providing frameworks analogous to how a building is composed of joists, floors, beams, poured concrete pillars, walls, and floors that are filled in. For them, writing a song is like constructing a building. In Giant, as we call it for short, we relate songwriting to constructing a bridge. So I thought we'd start, as Louis does in the performance, by thinking about laying down some joists with the idea of the verse. In an earlier unedited version of the show, this is how Louis describes verses. A verse seems simple. It's where we do the heavy lifting of telling the story. Who, why, where, who else? Across several verses, a story can have development, twists and turns. So let's think first about how the narratives in the show were developed and why. In gigs that we presented in the earlier half of the Distant Voices project, we collected audience feedback. And in reading through that feedback, we realized how many of the comments were focused around the introductions to songs that the performers spoke or read out. And there was a realization of how much these introductions meant to listeners and how much work they do in meaning making along with the songs. So we took the decision to focus on expanding our practice around these moments, kind of lavishing attention on them, and looking at those as part of the art form as well as the songs. We started that process by attending to what I call resonances. When you sing a note into a piano or into the body of a guitar, a note will sing back at you. That's the resonance of the piano, the fabric of parts of the piano that vibrate in common with what you sang. One of our practices on the project was to sing things into the project and see what resonated. In an initial step, for example, Phil sifted through the 100-odd songs that we'd collected at that time and noted similarities in themes and images across them all. Numerous objects floated to the surface of that exercise, and we took those objects and laid them out as part of workshops with participants in prison to see which were chosen as inspiration for songs and how those resonated with the others. As part of that process, we held a Vox session in HMP Castle Huntly, and we focused on the emerging theme of bridges. The song Everything's Spherical was written in that session. You might have heard this song in the Looking at Colours Again EP or in some of the Distant Voices gigs. There was a standout line in that song, an intriguing and compelling invitation that says, "Come stand on this bridge and be a giant. Come stand on this bridge and be Goliath." I wanted us to start folding narratives out of some of the songs. Rather than writing narratives and matching songs from the project with the narratives, we wanted to work the other way around. So I began thinking about this line and what it might mean. And so I started researching giants. What do giants mean to people? What kind of stories do people tell about giants? They're a figure of fear because of their size and because they're outsiders. So they're often imprisoned or persecuted, sometimes unjustly, but they're also heroic figures. And these themes reminded us of stigma and inflationary press coverage of crime and imprisonment. It also reminded us of great strength and fortitude that so many of our participants display. And through this process of research, I discovered a folk story called The Giant Who Had No Heart in His Body, about a giant imprisoned for many years who asks a prince to help him get his heart back. This story and the image of the giant then began to resonate with other songs from the project. It started to connect them and make them sing together. Primarily, I thought about the song Autopilot, which describes the kind of emotional autopilot required to survive prison life and the use of substances to numb experience. And so another theme began emerging. Phil and Ian, Rachel and Liam and I then went on to work on developing that story as one strand of narrative within the show. Alongside the narrative emerging about the heartless giant, we also began developing ideas for other narratives using our Pebbles method. Very briefly, this was inspired by Phil's field notes, shared with us in poem form in Conversation 1, where she recounted a very poignant moment where one man on a session gifted her a pebble he had found in the gravel path inside the prison walls. The pebble is special, he told her, but no one noticed it lying among the gravel. He wanted her to have it, to take it out beyond the prison walls. Our community of inquiry then began a process of collecting what we called pebbles from among the hidden places of the project data, the discarded details, the background noises, the throwaway or overheard comments, the snippets of stories, the objects or things that we encountered along the way that we found special, beautiful, striking, but no one had yet noticed them. Once we had many of these pebbles, we began making little cairns by piling pebbles together on songs that they related to or connected with. And I'm trying to change my slide and it won't change.
I've got it.
Oh, right. Here we are with our pebbles. This helped us draw out more connections and resonances and develop other themes, often workshopping those themes with participants to develop them further and to write more songs exploring them. Those emerging narratives were then developed by the artists who were involved and the dramaturg, now director, Liam Hurley. At that stage, we included co-writers or participants with relevant forms of experience in that process, or we used interview material with them in order to do that. Most of the songs in Giant were written in Vox sessions with participants or other workshops, but each musician in the show sings one song that they wrote specifically for the piece in order to advance the flow of the narratives and to link the songs together in the way that you'll see. The main themes that emerge through this process and that weave the narratives of A Giant on the Bridge together are heartlessness. That's heartlessness of systems, as well as the heartlessness living or working in those systems can entail. How to find a heart again or your heart as home. Letters, unheard or unread letters and the distant voices in them. The breaking down of communicational possibility by aspects of the criminal justice system. And letters to everyone that are calls to action or change. Then bridges, obviously, how and where to create them, the toll and difficulty of creating them, and what music does to help create that space. And then giants or monsters, the fear of monsters, a sense of size, sometimes it's out of proportion, the visibility or invisibility of people returning home from punishment, and the importance of seeing people or hearing their voice, and then unexpected heroism or villainy. In the songs that we chose to include and in the narratives that were developed, we also wanted to reflect the key perspectives that are present in our study and in our community of inquiry that's been carrying out that study. And this shaped the narratives that emerged too. We wanted to highlight the richness of participation in the project beyond just the perspectives of those sentenced to imprisonment and make visible the places of connection between those viewpoints. These are really vital spaces to consider if you want to move the narrative around integration away from individuals making the journey and out to wider communities and structures. So early on, we made a clear decision that shaped the project. We wanted to foreground 5 main perspectives. First and foremost, homecomers, those who have served short-term and long-term sentences, both male and female. So we have the story of Dee coming out after a short sentence, and Gerda. See Rachel in the background there. She talks about Gerda, who's been imprisoned for a very long time. Then we have welcomers, family and wider community, adults and children who are tasked with welcoming people home. And that's primarily represented by the story of June and Faye. Thirdly, we have mediators, songwriting facilitators like Louis and others who help facilitate dialogue within the system. Then we have system workers, prison officers, criminal justice social workers, prison managers, other support workers in community justice and addiction services. And the character that I narrate, Clem, represents them. And then finally, there's those harmed by crime. And pretty much everyone in the show has a story that relates to that. So I'm presenting them all here, although Clem's story presents it most clearly. The show attempts to recognize that system workers are often also mediators and welcomers, that homecomers and welcomers are also those harmed by crime. Our research has shown us that the separation and isolation of these perspectives is a problem that is generated and sustained by the structure of the criminal justice service and all systems, and also our current democratic structures. As Oliver told us in conversation 2 last week, in a time of hyperconnectivity, our societies are growing a critical mass of disconnections. We have a justice system sustained by a political system that works as an engine for myriad dynamics of othering, driving fragmentation, polarization, and simplification. Elsewhere, Oliver's written that it's necessary to create alternative spaces and experimental dynamics that allow communication to go beyond the ritualized opposition of the argument culture and that enrich the communication fabric of public debate. A key question that runs through Distant Voices, the work of Vox Liminis, and through Giant is, how can music or song help us to build a space for these perspectives to be together? Famous songwriter Jimmy Webb describes the building of words into songs beautifully like this. In the dictionary, the songwriter finds oaken words, and words like steel beams, rich resonant words of mahogany and cherry, rococo words that swirl like burled walnut, simple pungent pine words, heavy words of dark ebony, ephemeral silly words of balsa, everlasting words of marble and granite, and translucent words like colored glass. So what can these words build? And this brings me to the section of a song we call The Bridge. The bridge we explore in Giant is just such an alternative and experimental space, a space of connection, of bringing people into the circle, of moving from monologue to dialogue, one that we hope can enrich the fabric of the styles of communication that we're limited to by our current systems. As Louis says in the show, by the time we're on the third or fourth chorus, you might take it for granted. So as songwriters, if we want to take you somewhere new, we take you to the bridge. The bridge is a bit strange, a bit uncertain, a shift in perspective we go through before landing back in safe familiarity. The bridge that we explore in the show is really the understanding of a space where very different perspectives can meet together and have dialogue. A bridge is neither here nor there. It's a liminal space, a space of transition or uncertainty, of possibility and hope. And in the show, there is the intersection of many bridges, one for each of the characters. There's the bridge that Dee crosses on his way home, the first day out of prison. There's a drawbridge that the confrontation happens on in the fairy tale, in which we discover what happens to the missing heart. There are the bridges across huge chasms that Clem marvels at the impossibility of the architecture of as she considers reaching out to someone who's harmed her. And then we have the bridge as a section of a song. We see the creation of that space slowly emerging through the show. The setting of the performance space in a circle indicates openness to equality of sharing between the musicians in the show, to looking at and listening to each other. When the show starts, the stories are told effectively as monologues, each given by a single person in the center of the circle. As we move along, these slowly turn into several musicians inhabiting the circle at a time. And towards the end of the show, we see a dialogue happen that draws all the characters into the center of the circle as they realize how their stories intersect and affect each other. We can watch a moment in the show when the stories begin to coalesce on bridges, masterfully crafted by Liam Hurley now. Sorry, here we go. It's not there. Okay, I'll just carry on. I think we've got a technical glitch and the videos aren't there. Maybe someone can post the timestamps into the chat so that you can go and look at them later. I'm really sorry about that. It would have been nice to see that. This question of how we create such a bridging space, does one exist? Particularly in the criminal justice context, is a difficult one. The cultural sense, exacerbated by our media and the action of the system in separating people out, is of a very difficult, harmful, incompatible, or combative relationship between certain perspectives. There's a lot of fear around the idea of making a space where these voices can be together. How do we make that shift in perspective that Louis describes? The place we take you to so that coming home is a brilliant feeling again. As this question began emerging through our work and we realized that this should be a central exploration in Giant, we decided to set up a workshop on it with people who practice forms of justice that bring different perspectives together. So we planned a trip to Northern Ireland to work with mediators, restorative justice practitioners, and others interested in facilitating dialogue between people who may have caused harm to others or to community spaces and those who'd been harmed. We took with us songs from the project that we had chosen because they presented contrasting perspectives. And we asked the mediators, if these two songs were people that you were facilitating to meet and have dialogue, how would you approach that? What might they say? And how would you help dialogue to happen? And then we wrote songs together that reflected those answers. 4 songs resulted from that incredible workshop. And one of them, called Resolution, features in A Giant on the Bridge. I had wanted to let you hear part of it, but I won't be able to do that just now. But again, someone will post the time codes into the chat so you can watch that later. But resolution describes both the process of dialogue or mediation and an amazing sense of hopefulness that a place does exist where these perspectives can be brought together. But also that in doing that, we get better resolution. People are seen and heard more clearly and recognized for who they are. This sense of the bridge being a space of dialogue, primarily carried through Giant by the narrative around Clem and her journey, we developed out of those songs. There's one more question raised here by our talking about and standing on the bridge, and that's what happens when we return to the chorus, when we come home. Louis, as he closes the show, describes the chorus like this. The chorus is the bit of a solo song that all the performers sing along with. It's the moment we find out what we can do together. Our small voice becomes larger as we sing together. If the verse tells a story, then the chorus would be the moral of that story. It's a comfy blanket, a beating heart, the place we return to, like coming home. In a project such as this, looking at such a complex theme from so many different perspectives and using a creative method with lots of layers and voices in it, there is no moral of the story. There's no conclusion we can make today. But the strength of this way of synthesizing things is that we can make a space where people's voices join together in something. David Hesmanhalsh says, I think that what happens during a good performance is that the multiple differences among us are forgotten and we are fully focused on an activity that emphasizes our sameness. He talks about getting lost in dancing or singing along together. But we do also engage with that singing for different reasons and different purposes. Songs are gracious and generous creations, and they facilitate many different uses, including negative and destructive ones. These different ways of engaging with songs, as problem-solving devices, as Phil would call it, are demonstrated in how the characters in A Giant on the Bridge engage with music. So Dave's character, says he uses rap to organize his thoughts. June, Jill's character, uses singing songs for distraction from troubles, to connect with her niece over dinner and dancing. But she's also disconnected from the practice of being able to perform her singing by the situation in which she finds herself, a victim of domestic abuse and parent now to her niece. The songwriter Louis' character facilitates songwriting to create a temporary creative community, as he describes it, to encourage vulnerability and openness in participants, to provide hope. Faye, Dee's daughter, uses stories to help her sleep, to connect to her dad, to process what's happening to her. And Clem, my character, uses storytelling and poetry to process past trauma, to engage with difficult themes at one remove, to distract from dealing with or talking about her past, to listen for resonance, so to understand what rings out in response to certain subjects, and then to make a clarion call, much like the song Dear Everyone that opens the show, to the wider community. In Clem's case, this is about working together to change the system. The question of what we can sing together and also whose voice we sing with was a clue that we followed through the making of the piece. We wanted to convey the complexity of the voices present in the songs that we share as part of Distant Voices Coming Home and create an artistic output that contains within it some kind of overt exploration of that. So we hint at the complexity of the voices that are contained within Distant Voices by introducing various ambiguities about the perspectives of the musicians and their relationships to the stories that they tell. We have realism in Dee's story, but when he introduces Dee, he says he's not real, but he doesn't know that. We have realism from Clem, but it's punctuated by these stories that she drifts off into. And we see how she uses those stories to distract herself from things she doesn't want to think about. We have a kind of personal ethnography. So Louis tells the story of his work on a typical songwriting session, or sorry, the songwriter's work on a typical songwriting session. So he's highlighting the way in which the songs in the show were created and telling the listeners that as they hear them. But we do have that question that I just raised there, that is Louis the songwriter character, or is he not the songwriter character? And this allows us space to question who we are when we perform music and present songs to people. Then we have the fairy tale or the myth. It's a folk tale, so it's a kind of collection of societal attitudes and questions about giant figures and imprisonment and crime and power and hierarchy. But we've also subverted that folktale a little bit, and that raises questions about it too. And then finally, we have this twin perspective in the show, a kind of distorted mirror experience between the siblings who had a very similar journey and then diverged. The issue of Jill's accent highlights that too, because we have to imagine that she's Scottish, but actually she's American. So we think about forms of experience that are similar, but also different. The complexity of how we receive and perceive these perspectives and the questions about them that remain unanswered serve, we hope, the purpose of conveying quite how complex these distant voices in the songs are. As Phil highlighted in conversation 1, songs are social. They're co-creations made within and by temporary creative communities. They always include multiple voices, and they are performed by collections of people with multiple voices entwined, and then they are received by groups of people forming temporary communities in concert halls or living rooms, and who interpret them collectively. It's important that we highlight this because we also make stories of justice and reintegration together too, in a complicated way. It's not just about one individual voice. We participate in the heartlessness of systems together. We don't just observe someone making themselves heartless from afar at a remove. Reintegration isn't a solo, single-voiced endeavor. It's more like a chorus. The best way to conclude then is not with my single voice anyway. We'd love to hear yours. You also participate in making the meaning of a giant on the bridge and in distant voices coming home. Your voice is in it too, as you bring to it your experiences and perspectives, as you reflect on your own role with relation to the narratives and the situations presented. So we'd love to hear your thoughts now and open up the call to comments and questions and other voices. So it's over to us all.
Okay, thanks, Jo. That was rich and full of ideas, and I'm sure there's going to be loads of questions.
Songs.
Well, actually, I mean, it's given us a bit more time than we would have had for Q&A, so it's good. Yes. And we have put in the chat, exactly where you can find those specific elements in Giant. So if you want to go back and look later, then do so.
Excellent.
Now, one question that came up in the chat was from Martin, who specifically kind of asked about the song Autopilot and questioned whether what it's getting at is to do with the way that a person becomes institutionalized, and how that creates the difficulty of switching off autopilot at the point of release. And I wonder, bringing that into the framework of the kind of wider representation of these issues in Giant, is there something about Dee's character where the struggle to switch the autopilot off and to move into the kind of outside world to escape the clutches of institutionalization, that part of the story?
Yeah, you hear that. There's one of the kind of rapt monologues that he does where he talks about a messed up kind of safeness inside, and how he's nervous about, he could mess things up when he gets out. And he talks about dampening down in masks. He talks about masks a lot, putting on a mask, and how do you get it off? And once you lock something away, the lock rusts, and how do you unrust it? So Dee is definitely very aware of those things. It's also in Gerda's story too. When the guards drag her back to prison, she says she has the offer of her heart back from the prince, and she says, "What good would my heart be if you're going to put me back in there?" Yeah. So she actually rejects the heart because she needs to be in that state. And there's also the question that the prince asks, why has she gone smashing off in that direction and not towards her heart? So there's a big question in the fairy tale that's told about how Gerda relates to her heart and why. And those questions are really tied up in that story too. Yep.
Great. I'm just going to have a look and see if anyone else has their hands up. It is just another opportunity to plug the podcast, because actually we discuss Autopilot in the first episode, and listening to it in the context of recording that first episode of the podcast, I was struck by how the music conveys something hypnotic, and how institutions hypnotize us. And I'm just as you were talking about it today, I was thinking part of the function of research is to take us out of the trance of seeing things a particular way, and escaping the kind of structures that get written into the way that we make sense of the world around us. So maybe there's a lot more to breaking the spell than would first appear. So I'm looking in the chat and I'm looking for any hands up in the room. Here's a question from James. Was there always an intention to perform the songs and video them?
There was always an intention to perform the songs. Yes, there was, yes. But we had hoped we would do it in front of an audience as a live performance, and then it would be filmed just as a kind of legacy to show what had happened. But then the film became the thing that we needed to do to escape the pesky germs and their clutches. So yeah, then it did become a different project when we started thinking about it as a film. And this idea of putting us in a circle came because we didn't have an audience to face. So we're like, well, who is the audience? And then we realized that the audience were each other. So the kind of extra narrative of that Louis introduces the show with, of the musicians coming together to tell each other stories and sing each other's songs. I don't know if that would have been in the original show that we had planned for live, because it came about. And actually, I think it's a really good thing that it did, because it's really enriched it in a way we wouldn't have got to had we done it back last year.
I know that Oliver's always fond in the project of reminding us of the importance of 3 layers or forms of dialogue. So we talk about dialogue within, so the way in which the creative processes stimulate us to almost be in dialogue with ourselves or our own experiences, dialogue between the protagonists in a creative process, and then dialogue beyond, which is with the audience that engages with the work. And maybe just in response to James, it's also worth saying, when the songs are written in Vox sessions, we always negotiate consent for their sharing, and songwriters have the choice to say no to that. So it's up to people whether or not they want to, if you like, put their song in the pool of songs that's available for us to share in public, to advance the conversation. But almost everybody, in my experience, says yes, they want their song to be shared if the opportunity arises and if it's helpful for the conversation. But it's important to honour people's preferences there.
Yep, and we did invite all the co-writers of the songs to see a preliminary version of the show.
Phil has her hand up, and since Phil was a key person in the production of Giant, we should definitely hear from her. So maybe unmute yourself and just ask away, Phil.
Hey, thank you, Joe. That was beautiful, very lucid and really interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking about the really important point you made about fear of bringing people into the room with multiple perspectives that are seen as opposing in some way, and the fact that your recognition that so many of us actually occupy multiple perspectives. And it actually made me think as well about a sort of whether there's also, well, this is a bit of a comment than a question.
Please comment, Phil. Please comment.
Within academia, the idea that I'm thinking of sort of Howard Becker's "Whose Side Are You On?" The idea that to do sort of politically committed research, that there's a sort of almost a danger in listening to the wrong people, as if you engaged with people who have been harmed by crime, that means that automatically you're a sort of carceral scholar that is on the side of more prisons and more punishment. Anyway, yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting thing to maybe think about. Yeah,
and I think, you know, there are lots of strands that come together in Giant that highlight, I guess, in subtle ways, that the systems that don't work are damaging to everyone on all sides of them in different ways. And that was really the sense that I got, that people are invisible and voices are dampened and left unheard, and people are harmed on all sides of an equation that separates people out. And you hear that, you know, Clem tells a story of all the answers she needed being shut in the back of a police van and driven away forever. And that was a line directly taken from one of the mediators from the restorative justice workshop, who spoke about that being a really common experience for people who want to understand what's happened to them, to the harm that's been caused, but systems at the moment don't allow that to happen. So yeah, those thoughts are really present with us.
Yeah, and it also reminds me that Lucy, who I'm just about to invite to share a bit of her own work within the project and beyond. Lucy, very early in the life of the project, introduced the core group to the idea that none of us has or is a single story, and escaping the kind of the tyranny of the single story is really important. And yet the criminal justice system operates by forcing people into a single story, or perhaps by forcing a single story on people. So with that elegant segue, I shall pass back to Lucy, who's going to talk to us for a little bit now. And if we can ask you to mute again for the next section, mute and end your video feeds if you had them on at all. And we'll have a little bit from Lucy, a tiny bit from me, and then we'll come back to you about 1 o'clock. So Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fergus. That was the perfect intro, because that's exactly what I'm going to be chatting a little bit about. Before I start, I just want to give you a wee reminder of our collective poem. I just had a peek and it looks awesome already. Thanks for all the contributions. And if you want to contribute to that, you're welcome to do so. If you can't access the Google Doc, you can write in the chat and finish the sentence. To build bridges, we're going to need something. Okay, so I've been doing a PhD in parallel with Distant Voices, and this came out of a number of years working in community development and community music, both with people in and around the criminal justice system, but also with people who've migrated to the UK from other countries. There are lots of echoes and resonances between what we've been learning about building community after punishment and building community after migration. What I'm particularly interested in here is how people connect through creative practice. What are some of the mechanics and the politics of what is going on when we make things together? And how might these tiny, fleeting insights translate to larger scale social change? I could literally talk all day about these questions, but I'm going to try to keep this brief. So let's begin with a quote from Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. In conversation 1, Phil told us a bit about the idea of enforced narratives, stories that people are compelled to tell over and over again because that is what is demanded by courts and justice systems, for example, or by the Home Office as part of the asylum process. These thin, one-dimensional, repeated stories of wrongdoing or trauma or need can easily become the only story. This is how stereotyping works. One experience or identity marker, often in somebody's past, is made into the only story. This isn't a passive process. Research shows that it's actively pursued by governments, by the media, and by others that stand to benefit from erasing complex intersecting identities and instead constructing flattened caricatures, the migrant or the offender, one-dimensional portraits that paint people as undesirable, to be feared or excluded or at best pitied. Others. This isn't new information. We know that stereotyping and stigma and prejudice are a huge barrier to people trying to make it home safely from prison or to build a home again after migration. At the first event, Martin wrote in the chat, a word that came up again and again at a Vox residential was alienation. The word alien, which came to us via Latin and French, means belonging to another, part of them, not part of us. The more we dig into this, the more we see that single story practices are still widespread in international development, in research, in the arts too. Often this is well-intentioned work that seeks to spark change by sharing stories of suffering and pain. Eve Tuck, an Indigenous researcher in Canada, calls this damage-centered research. She says this is research that intends to document people's pain and brokenness, to hold those in power accountable for their oppression. This kind of research operates with a flawed theory of change. It is often used to leverage reparations or resources for marginalized communities, yet simultaneously reinforces and reinscribes a one-dimensional notion of these people as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. When we collaborate from our single story identities, everyone involved becomes confined, not only the prisoner or the asylum seeker, but all of us. The academic is confined to only expressing themselves in certain ways: knowledgeable, expert, detached, observing, head knowledge only, minimal space for emotions or spirituality, uncertainty or incompetence. The prison officer, if personal protection training is anything to go by, is immersed in an environment that puts people on either side of a thick line, goodies or baddies, and confines them to performing those identities. These labels not only limit our capacity to understand each other's past experience, but we also restrict each other's room to grow into anything different in the future. Our language gestures back into the past. Words like ex-offender place people on a leash, constantly being pulled back to a single point in the past. We can't reach out and bridge the space between us because these single stories don't offer common ground. By extension, the process of integration or reintegration becomes impossible to imagine. We are jigsaw pieces that simply don't fit together. This is where being creative together unleashes a kind of disruptive magic. Sometimes artistic interventions like the songs created in Distant Voices are primarily seen in terms of their communicative value, sharing someone's story with a wider audience, often in the hope of sparking empathy or action or change. And this is important, but that's not the whole story. It's important to also consider the act of creating together in terms of its connective value. I've been trying to understand the mechanics of how these connections are created, and I've been drawn again and again to multiplicity, recognizing our many stories, our many identities, our many past and future selves. We can find all sorts of connections to other practices that help us to better understand these processes. In narrative therapy, for example, we find therapeutic practices that help us to recognize multiplicity, to find connections between our stories through a process called outsider witnessing. When we share our stories and tell them back to one another and explain what resonated, they become richer and more complex in the telling. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why the shared songwriting process is such a powerful tool. In The Giant on the Bridge, Louis' character says something along the lines of, "It's my job to help people find some hope," to find and express the shifting kaleidoscope of all the other stories that are going on in the background. In the context of creative work and songwriting with people who have migrated, language and multilingualism is another way into being multiple. People coming to the UK are so often perceived in terms of linguistic lack. Your English isn't good enough. We miss or devalue the multiplicity of other languages, the treasure chest of words that people often carry inside them. Multilingual creative processes are one way of redressing that balance. This might seem less relevant or useful to creative work in the Scottish criminal justice system, but here we can think about voice, accent, dialect as fulfilling a similar role. We can create together in a way that amplifies voices that go unheard. Entrenched power dynamics are unsettled by shared creativity. In the kind of temporary communities that we've built in Distant Voices through Vox sessions, all bets are off. We're all vulnerable, all uncertain, all tentatively trying out ideas, offering fragments of words or sounds, opening up spaces where our stories can become entangled. Even in something as seemingly insignificant as a love for Domino's Texas BBQ dipping sauce. These are spaces where we can be multiple, layered, complex, messy, and unsure, where power dynamics can begin to be questioned, and where we can all be unmade and remade collectively. Grant Kester is a professor of art history, and he coined a term, dialogical aesthetics. This is a widening out of the concept of the artwork, where the art is not only located in the finished artifact that is created, but in the process by which it is made. Not only in the song, but in the making of the song. The art exists between us as we create, in the fleeting, liminal, interstitial spaces and connections. What I'm sketching out here is a route towards entanglement, towards bringing our stories together not out of pity or obligation or need or professional duty, but out of curiosity and care and solidarity. And as we entangle our individual narratives, we start to see connections to wider stories of injustice and oppression and resistance that affect us all. We understand the bigger picture. Behruz Bouchani, a Kurdish Iranian journalist who was detained at Manus Island Detention Center for 6 years, is an expert in seeing these connections to bigger stories. When he was asked, what can we do to help the situation for detainees? He made the connection. He was asked this by Louise Welsh, author and professor of creative writing at Glasgow University. She was asking, what can we do from here to help these detainees that are so far away? And Bouchani made the connection to Ken Loach's film, I, Daniel Blake, about the struggle to survive in the face of benefit sanctions and a hugely unjust system. He could see the same contours of structural injustice, systems that confine and restrict people's ability to thrive, physical and mental oppression, lack of care, and struggle for survival in both of these stories. And he said this, you are not fighting for us, you're fighting for your own society. And when our stories become entangled in ways large and small, we move away from an us and a them, from mismatched jigsaw pieces. We counteract alienation and we enable resistance and solidarity. In conversation one, we saw a short film about Martin's incredible sculptures and the process of making them. And in the chat box after watching it, William commented, perhaps the question is not meant to be answered, rather to dissolve the questioner. That comment has stayed with me, to dissolve the questioner. I think that's a really poetic way of summing up what we're talking about here. To build bridges, we need to be vulnerable and take risks, to be willing to be dissolved and become part of a greater whole. I'm going to finish by sharing a wee excerpt of a song called More Than One, which I wrote with a group called Life After Detention in Glasgow, a group who had experienced immigration detention in Dungavel Detention Centre. Sorry, 1 second. We wrote the song by playfully exploring our own names, their meanings, their sound, their linguistic and cultural resonances, the family connections and histories that are enfolded into our names. We used our names to generate chord progressions and melodies and lyrics, finding all sorts of commonalities and entanglements along the way. And then we recorded the song together with all of our voices and all of our languages. The song is written not only in English, but also includes lyrics in Arabic, Kurdish, Urdu, Amharic, and Swahili. And it ends on the line, I have more than just one name in all these languages. I hope that gives you a little flavor of the multiplicities and layers and entanglements that we were exploring together.
My name is strong. My name's an autumn month. My name will change and stay the same. My name will share my pains. My name will share my dreams. My name is waiting to begin.
Thanks for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Fergus now to share some thoughts.
Okay, how can I follow that? It's funny actually, just listening to it at the end there, I was thinking that's like the hypnotic quality of that song is like the absolute inversion of the hypnosis of autopilot. So if autopilot's about the institution hypnotizing us, that's about, I don't know, waking us up into community through all those voices so beautifully combined. But let me say in 5 minutes what I was going to say. So, and I'm going to try and pull many threads together from the whole process here. And obviously I speak as somebody rooted in criminal justice, as a practitioner, and then as a researcher. Before Distant Voices, I already knew, both from the practice experience and from research, that criminal justice often does more harm than good. And as I've listened to people's stories and songs in this project, I've been confronted much more forcefully than ever with the ways in which criminal justice simplifies, flattens, and distorts human stories, experiences, and identities. And it's through those processes that punishment goes on to alienate, literally, to make aliens of people, to marginalize and to exclude them. People's true stories are appropriated, they're stolen from them, and then they're rewritten in and through the determinative power of the state and its institutions. And that state story making turns people into strangers, and it teaches us to rage at them, to fear them, or to pity them. It's not surprising then that people subject to this power often feel incapacitated by it, since it misrecognizes and misrepresents them, as well as denying them the material resources that they need to find a way forward. So what have we learned from all of this about how we do find a way forward in spite of everything? And also what have we learned about how we stand against those processes? Quite early in the project, Joe introduced us to a simple conceptualization of what music making might do in justice settings. It's from Lee Wolf and Denny Wolf's paper, May the Songs I Have Written Speak for Me, which was published in 2012. And they present sparking and bridging as two horns of a dilemma. While music workshops in prisons, they say, might spark engagement, they provide no way of bridging out or connecting the newfound enthusiasm into the participants' wider lives going forward. I think we in Distant Voices have always been sensitive to that dilemma and to the short-lived nature of Vox sessions themselves, and we've done things to address that. But in the way that I think about sparking and bridging now, through Distant Voices, I've altered the meanings a little. So for me, sparking has come to refer to how sessions and songwriting initiate and energize individual creativity, and through it, a related exploration of our lives and experiences. In obvious ways, that sparking links to broader processes of education and personal development for all of us, something which is much wider and much more fundamental than the idea of rehabilitation. Bridging, for me, refers to how sessions allow for the development and mediation of social relationships. New connections are made in sessions, and existing relationships, both inside and outside of prisons, are remade in new ways through the songs, their writing and their sharing. But what I want to add to the framework of sparking and bridging is the idea of bonding. And in a sense, this goes back to the project's origins in its recognition of problems of stigmatization and alienation that we've been discussing already. These are problems of being socially ostracized, of being denied the bonds of fraternity and solidarity that we all rely on. In a sense, it's about being placed beyond the pale, or if you like, being put into the void. As we think about how bridge building has been explored in the project, including, for example, in A Giant on the Bridge and in Making Things New, It strikes me that, important as they are, bridges are most often places of transition, not places of ultimate belonging or dwelling. We need them to get where we want to be, but we rarely intend them to be the destination. The bridges that sessions build sometimes lead to bonds. And this happens most often when people engage with Vox Liminis and with Unbound, our continuing community here, in a sustained way. Here, the session sparks are kindled or rekindled, and people cross the bridges into sustained connections, into an ongoing community which demonstrates and practices solidarity. Importantly, Unbound is a community of diverse people with different backgrounds, different histories, different resources, different beliefs, different opinions, but nonetheless, it seems to hold together. And I think that's partly because its foundations were laid in creative and dialogical practices. And those practices together are capacious or generous enough to celebrate and sustain diversity, rather than reaching for uniformity or a settled position or a consensus. Membership in this kind of solidaristic community doesn't depend on conforming to a certain identity, ideology, or worldview, but rather on being willing to creatively explore and share a social life together. So in conversation one, a brand new member of our Unbound community, William, as we've already heard, wrote in the chat that perhaps the question's not meant to be answered, rather to dissolve the questioner. And I'm also still thinking about what that means, but maybe it's about not settling into an answer, a fixed identity or position or life project or community project. It's not even about answering the question. It's about what happens in the process of exploring the question together. It is, I think, about settling into the unsettledness of things in solidarity with curious and creative companions. So maybe we can bond on the bridge after all. Maybe we can stay creatively unsettled together. So the clue that I'm left wanting to follow centers on learning more about the processes and practices that somehow enable diverse people to move beyond serious conflict and harm into situations of sustained community, fraternity, and solidarity. And with a few others, I've started referring to these as processes and practices of generative justice, meaning an approach to justice problems that's generative of, rather than destructive of, social solidarity. I think we urgently need to figure out what that means and what it entails. And I'm pretty sure that Thursday night's closing gig is going to help us hear and feel it. So I think it's time for us to take a short comfort break. And then after a few minutes, maybe give ourselves 5 minutes, we're going to come back and leave some time for Q&A. So we are at, let me check my watch. We're at 1:05, so let's come back at 1:10 for the Q&A. We're almost on time, which is pretty remarkable with 3 people giving talks. So great, we'll see you in 5 minutes at 1:10.
The nose like a sniffer dog, I can smell home. We are human when we walk in. We turn to numbers and we are forgotten. Fear can't describe these feelings inside. Live with so many people, there's nowhere to hide. Daydream bars and multicolored chairs. Alone but watched, spotlight eyes everywhere. The concrete crime school is where most friendships are grown. Feel I've been here for ages. Life like a book, don't judge until you've read the pages. Don't count the days, make the days count. Learn to cope, nose like a sniffer dog, I can smell home. We are human when we walk in. We turn to numbers and we are forgotten. Did they forget us?
Hi, welcome back. We're going to invite you to unmute and to come on camera if you would like to, and try and have a bit of a chat where we can actually see each other, which will be a treat. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already from Gary and from Elsie, and I'm wondering whether you guys would like to come on camera and unmute and say your questions, or whether you'd like me to just read them out from the chat.
I'm happy to say mine if that's.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gary. It's nice to hear your voice.
Thank you. No, I was just really interested in, you've got a lot of different people involved in your work. You've got sort of academics, professional musicians, the people that you're working with as well. So I'm kind of really interested in that kind of the personal and professional versions of ourselves that we sometimes have or don't. So a lot of people try and just be themselves and be authentic, and that's something. But I suppose I'm just really interested in how in the work that you've done, is there a level playing field, or are you trying to create a level playing field for people's participation and engagement? Or I'm just interested in all the thinking behind that.
Do you want me to have a go, Lucy?
Yeah, go for it. Do you get one of you guys want to come in on that? Certainly, yeah, I've got lots to say as well, but you go.
Well, I'll be very brief. I mean, I think the project was kind of founded on the principle that there are lots of different forms of expertise and that different people would bring different things. That's why we constructed a core group that was diverse in terms of its experience and background. And one thing I would say about leveling is that everybody experiences moments of empowerment, I guess, that come from being in the position of having expertise in that moment in relation to that subject. And then everybody experiences the opposite, which is like the complete disabling terror of not being good at something or not knowing how to do something. And the point of having a community of inquiry is that we try to hold each other in those moments and draw on the strengths of the relevant people at the relevant time. But it doesn't eliminate power differentials. Those have to be kind of constantly struggled with. But it helps, I guess, is the simplest way I could put it. But
Okay.
We found it helpful to think about there's a sort of anarchist concept of the temporary autonomous zone, which is kind of a temporary space where a community of people come together, and these are recognized as spaces that can have a kind of leveling effect on power dynamics, and that can be creative and empowering spaces, but by their nature they are only temporary. And when you conduct songwriting workshop for 3 days in a prison context, there is such a sense of contrast between the type of space that we try to create where everyone is respected, where we try to create a level playing field where everyone is listened to. Such a contrast between that and then, you know, as soon as people step out of that room, it's a very different set of power dynamics that they're going into. So that's something that we've been talking about for a long time and trying to figure out, what resistance looks like in those contexts when it is only temporary, it's only a moment in time. But that's definitely helped us to understand that process of leveling the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, and I think we're just constantly trying to, like, it's never going to be perfect at all. And so it's just, I guess, foregrounding it and placing the complexity of it up front and acknowledging it and trying to make it present in the work that we're creating, and acknowledge it where it exists. We do some pretty intense debriefs after every session that we do, and these issues are talked about a lot. And there's an awful lot of learnings come out of the project about that too. So it's a constant area of note.
Thanks, Gary. Elsie, would you like to come in? You had a really interesting comment about post-traumatic theatre.
Yeah, hiya. Sorry, I can't put my camera on at the moment, but yeah, so I was really just commenting on the style of the performance last night, which I thought was really effective, and it kind of reminded me of post-dramatic theatre, which is kind of where the actors are kind of broken down into more performers, and so they're kind of present on stage but not necessarily acting as such, and I just felt that was really relevant for this, because it kind of allowed for a collaborative approach where the audience aren't necessarily separate from the performers, and also the performers aren't separate from the stories. And yeah, so I just thought that was particularly relevant because it just kind of highlighted how we were all interconnected with our own stories, really. And I thought it was a sort of, the style sort of perfectly highlighted that for me.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Yeah, it's really helpful to hear and think about that further. Thanks, Elsie.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, and it also relates to how we understand the closing session of our 3-day songwriting workshops, when we all share the songs that we've made. In that context, it's almost like a ritual where there's no distinction between performer and audience, and it's something that is a shared creative space. So thanks for that, Elsie. Tim, would you like to share your question? Or I can read it out from the chat.
Yes, I can. Hello. I was just listening, the various presentations, there were lots of criticisms of the criminal justice system, and I can naturally relate to that, but I just wonder if there are any glimmers of hope. Are there any aspects of the criminal justice system which actually are seeds of positivity? And I suppose my next question is, can artistic creativity help in building on these glimmers of hope?
I've been thinking about that one a lot, as you might imagine, as somebody who's been in the system as a practitioner and then studying it and trying to help change it in a variety of different ways over the course of a very long time. I have to admit that the general impact of all of this on me has been to believe less in the possibility of ameliorative reforms to the criminal justice system, because some of the dynamics that we've been discussing today are so fundamentally problematic that it's hard to imagine how you can improve the system without a really radical overhaul. To give you an example, our criminal justice system is based on adversarial principles. this is stealing ideas from Oliver again, but when Oliver introduced us early in the project to the concept of dialogue, he contrasted it with debate. I think the Latin origin of debate implies battering down your opponent. And that's how the criminal justice system functions. It functions through a supposed doctrine of equality of arms between two sides of a legal argument, and then one wins, and that story becomes the story, and it's then violently thrust upon all of the characters in the real human events that took place. So it might not satisfy a victim of crime because the official event that the crime as recorded in the conviction is not what they experienced. It might not satisfy the person who's prosecuted as the offender for other reasons. It might not satisfy the witnesses because what they saw isn't the official version that's eventually produced. So the justice system, because it is not dialogical, because it prevents a flow of meaning between people, it sets up really foundational problems. I do think, though, that people within the system can practice in ways which are dialogical and can create dialogical spaces to struggle against the institutionalized dynamics of criminal justice. But I'm more and more convinced that we need to change the foundations and not just try to deal with the kind of superstructure of it, if you see what I mean. I see Oliver's got his hand up, though, so I'll shut up.
Yeah, well, it was, I mean, yeah, it's picking up on Tim's point, but before that on Gary's point, because I think these two relate to each other. So from Gary's question, I take, there's a question there as well about equality between different people and whether you can bracket inequalities out of spaces, whether they are creative spaces or other kinds of spaces. And of course, the answer is no, you can never bracket inequalities, they shape everything. But this is the point we were trying to make in the conversation on Friday, this notion of prefiguration. What if we act as if? Right? We might not be able to bracket these very powerful structural forces, but can we act in the now as if trouble and subvert those inequalities? And in doing so, those spaces then create all kinds of possibilities. You learn through those relationships that then can cascade into other spaces. And that to me is the underlying theory of change here. Which leads to the question by Tim, which is, I was very new when I joined the project. I had a very kind of simplistic and external sense of the criminal justice system. And, for me, the glimmer of hope is in a lot of the people I've found in all kinds of parts of the system, in all kinds of positions and all kinds of perspectives across the system. So, and that takes us to that basic point that systems are human-made and therefore they can be unmade and remade. And it is through the relationships and the acting as if that maybe we begin to make that happen.
Thanks, Oliver. Lots of nodding heads there. James, you put your hand up. This is going to be the last question for just now. Go for it, James.
Oh, hi, I'm very dark, but I hope you can hear me. This goes off, I guess, goes off the back of something Fergus said in response to Tim, I think it was. I guess the background is I'm always often a bit surprised by the lack of representation of abolitionist perspectives when I go to criminologist conferences or the like. And I imagine that work such as yours, you're really familiar with the sort of reform agendas of it or the reform impacts of it. And I wonder if you've considered how work such as yours might contribute to an abolitionist agenda, or where does abolition sort of fit in your ambitions?
Big question, and a great one to end on. I guess I can't speak, there is no project position on that, right? We talk about this all the time, and I don't think we have a settled position, certainly not as a group or as a collective. I think in a sense, Oliver's last comment comes closest to describing how we do approach it in practice, which is to say, rather than choosing a position, abolitionist or reformist, we engage directly in the process of trying to do something that is different from the system that currently exists, to create and imagine a different future. In that respect, I do see certain parallels between some of what we've been talking about and transformative justice ideas that are linked to abolitionism in the American context. But this is something that I want to kind of study and think about a lot harder over the course of the next year or so. Yeah, I can't give a clearer answer than that.
Maybe Phil could tell us a bit about her project that's moving on from this one.
Good idea.
If you're up for that, Phil. Are you here, Phil?
Hi. Yeah, no, I'm still here. Hi. Yeah. So James, this is definitely something I'm thinking about. I'm actually just now starting an independent social research foundation fellowship for a year, which is going to involve running creative writing workshops with prison abolitionists and people working on transformative justice to try and fiction a future without prisons and then work out how we get there. So again, it's very much taking what kind of creative methods can bring in terms of a space of opening up a space to be and think otherwise. So yeah, please feel free to stay in touch with that. And there's so much I've learned from this project. And also I would say that one of the things that I think is really interesting is that it's hard to have an overt abolitionist perspective and get access to prisons and some of the people most affected by criminal justice. So I think that is something that we all need to think about. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, and there is a cautionary and open question left at the end of the fairy tale in A Giant on the Bridge, where you could see the prince as a reforming character. And there's many directions in which you could think about the ending of that story and what it signifies about those issues. But as they're stories, they're open to be told and retold and interpreted. Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone. As Claire mentioned in the chat, we are going to stay on the call after the event has officially finished. So it'd be really nice to continue this conversation. So many interesting points there and lots to be discussed. I am going to read out our collaborative poem. Isn't that exciting? We did it. There's some really beautiful lines in here, and yeah, I'm just going to read this out without further ado. And after that, I'm going to hand over to Les, who's going to share his reflections for us. Okay. To build bridges, we're going to need foundations. We're going to need interest and authenticity. We're going to need supports all the way along. We're going to need new ways of connecting. We're going to need a place to come from and a place to go. We're going to have to unlearn habits of a lifetime. And the bridges are going to have to be oxymoronic, built to be both strong and flexible, rigid and adaptive, magnificent and human-sized, built of past and future. To build bridges, we're going to need people who want bridges, people who know about bridges, people who want to look at bridges creatively, practically, and philosophically. We're going to need a bigger boat. We need to have patience, recognizing that no one should have to live under the bridge. We're going to need knowing that a bridge must be built from all sides. To build bridges, we're going to need to meet in the middle, to let go. To build bridges, we're going to need each other. To build bridges, we're going to need trial and error. We're going to need hope, courage, honesty, love. We're going to need the stuff that bridges are made of: wood, stone, metal, hope, vision, a desire to reach the other side. To be a bridge, we're going to need nuts, bolts, screws, and effort. Nuts, bolts, screws, efforts, and patience. To build bridges, we're going to need to be able to see the other side. To build bridges, we're going to need to want to go on a journey. The bridge isn't the destination. To build bridges, we're going to need that Batmobile tumbler thing. To build bridges, we're going to need to be a bridge. We're going to need someone on the other side. And what if besides the bridge, there's another bridge that takes you to the bridge when you fall from the bridge? And what if we end with a net of bridges so rich that living in between, connected, becomes the norm? Bridging as a way of life. Well done, everybody. Give yourselves a pat on the back for your creative writing efforts. That was beautiful. Over to you, Les. We're almost out of time, but if everybody's okay to hang on to the call for a little bit longer past 5:30, we'd love to hear what Les has got to say.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can. Well, what a tough act to follow. When Fergus asked me to do this, I was just delighted to have an opportunity to say something in honor of the project, really. I've followed the project from its very beginning. So I have something that I've been having to write and rewrite as every session has passed. It's called Giant Stories and Songs, a project that exceeds itself. The truth can be cruel, punishing, and heartless. It can be the whole truth and nothing but the truth of the judiciary oath, or about helping the police with their inquiries too. The truth as singular and fixed and fixing. The truth as punishment, enforced atonement, and imposed rehabilitation. Giant on the Bridge shows that in order to return to a deep sense of reality and truth, we need to first leave it. This involves a process of not just representation, but also re-enchantment. I took that very strongly from Giant. It blends, as has already been said, realist testimony, stories, letters, fables, reality, and magic, fact and fiction, where everyone is both simultaneously an author and a ghostwriter, perhaps even of themselves. There was a note in the chat from William Cleland, who shared a story about cleaning out a prisoner's cell after they died and finding a letter to his wife. Someone said in the chat how hard it must have been to remember that. And William just said, or wrote, "It's okay, it's real. We have to leave reality in order to return to it." It's really a compliment to be described as a friend of the project. And I wanted to share what I'd learned in the initial stages by making a podcast with my friend and podcast producer, Freya Hellier. So we travelled up to Glasgow in the winter of 2019, spent an amazing evening with the Unbound group, and interviewed so many people in the course of 2 days that I lost track, actually. And we met one of the participants called Ian. And in our interview, my sort of chirpy Cockney enthusiasm led me to ask Ian, well, isn't writing the songs at Unbound a way of creating community too? And in Ian's somber tones and accent, and those of you who know him, you'll almost be able to hear him say this. He said in almost a whisper, "It's better than that, actually." A project that exceeds itself. The dictionary definition of exceeding is to go beyond what is allowed or stipulated. I think Ian might like Webster's dictionary definition, which starts, be better than, surpass. And in the next few minutes, and it will only take a few minutes, I promise, I just want to say what those kinds of forms of exceeding capture for me or signal for me. It's a project that exceeds the problems it set out to answer. Songs are problem-solving devices, as Phil Crockett Thomas has coined this lovely phrase. problems that are solved through the songs, and problems that are left open. Each song solves many different problems for many different configurations or networks of listeners. It exceeds the relationship too between researchers and participants, between musicians and academics maybe. It's a form of what I would call sociable sociology, or sociology with people and not on them. Again, William, as others have mentioned, put it in a really beautiful way when he said perhaps it's less about answering the questions and more about dissolving the questioner. I think this allows questions to change properties and shape, for them to dissolve and then to take new shape again. I think too, one of the things that I've learned from following the project so closely is that it's a project that exceeds moral categories and shows, as Martin puts it, the world is a broken and beautiful place. I think this does speak to the discussion of abolitionism and what we might imagine beyond a world of prisons. It's an antidote to what I would call moral cannibalism that shapes the public discussion over crime and justice, a world that suffers not from doubt, but from certainty. Punishment and imprisonment requires certainty, but perhaps freedom and free lives require doubtful openness. And I think that's one of the lessons I took from watching and listening to Giant last night. It means living with the mutual implication or coexistence of things that might appear opposites, heroes and villains, fact and fiction, pleasure and pain, joy and sadness, imprisoned and fugitive, damaged and repaired. I think it also, one of the things that this idea of, better than that actually, that Ian captures so brilliantly, makes me think of is it exceeds its own forms and has created new forms of telling about the injustice of crime and punishment. As Chris Streever once commented that Louis Abbott was the ubiquitous Louis Abbott, and Louis in Giant last night had this beautiful line which I think bears repeating. My job is to find a little bit of hope in the hard stuff, a little victory in a place that wasn't built for creativity. You might feel flat, he says, in the following days after the sessions, and we feel it too. Sometimes the songs say it all. How many times have we heard people say after listening, I just can't follow that. We separate and punish and cause more harm. Couldn't we imagine something with more heart, Clem says in Giant. To do this, I think we need brave and difficult and hopeful projects like this one that are built from an architecture of connection and conduct a kind of sociology with and through the heart. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Empty calendar,